afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Connect, Live, and Thrive Africanus Parent Webinar. I am Bumi Olabi, CEO of Africanus, and I'll be your host for today's webinar. Today's discussion will focus on GCSE and A-level qualifications, what parents need to know. For many parents, this is a topic of great concern, especially in the wake of recent changes to the grading system and the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. As we navigate these uncertain times, it is essential that we understand that children's education is being evaluated and what steps we can take as parents to support them in achieving their academic goals. Over the next 15 minutes, we'll be discussing the latest developments in GCSE and A-level grading and assessment, and we'll provide you with valuable insights into how the system works. We'll look at the range of regulated qualifications, including GCSE and A-levels, the support available for children as they make decisions about their next steps, and also provide information on how to cope with examination pressure. We'll address some of the common questions and concerns that parents have, including how grades are calculated, what factors affect them, and how to interpret the results. And most especially, we will be taking questions from all of you watching today. So please stay around with us. Now let's take a moment to introduce our esteemed speakers for today. Today, we have with us Sean Blunt, Associate Director for Policy and Strategic Relationships for General Qualifications at Ofqual. Sean leads an equality and accessibility policy, and she's also the chair of Ofqual's Access Consultation Forum, which considers the accessibility of regulated qualifications and assessments. Before joining Ofqual in 2013, she worked in education and policy roles in local and central governments. She is the Vice Chair of Governors for our 2 local primary schools. Sean brings a wealth of knowledge and expertise to today's discussion. Thank you for joining us today. Thank you for being here with us today, Sean.
Thank you for having me.
Also, with us is the Manager, Policy and Strategic Relationships at Ofqual, Hazel Pitcher. She'll be looking at addressing some of the questions from parents today. We are excited to have you here with us today, Hazel.
Thank you for having me.
Lastly, I have my co-host, Peace George, Africanus Parent Lead. Thank you for sticking around, sis.
Thank you so much. God bless you.
So before we get started, some reminders for our audience. Please submit your questions for the panelists in the comment section or the Q&A section, and also interact in our live chat. Your questions will be answered by our panel speakers during this session. If we run out of time, if we run out of time to answer some of your questions, please be rest assured that our panel speakers will give a response to your questions later, and this will be shared on our parent web app and also on our website. You can also join our parent community via parent web app, so you don't miss out on any of our events, any of our webinars and resources for parents, and also events and resources for children as well. So let's get into the discussion for today. I've got a young boy who is going to be writing the GCSEs exam very soon, I think in 2 years. And recently, this year, we've had to select some of his subjects for the GCSE exams. And recently, while trying to select some of the subjects, I went on the internet, on Google, to check a couple of information on GCSE, and I saw things like AQA, EdExcel. So I told myself, okay, let's go for AQA. And then he said, no, he's doing EdExcel. I'm like, what's the difference? Well, what's EdExcel, what's AQA? And then further through that discussion, another parent joined in and said, oh, from my own, my son is going to be writing the WIJEC or the CCEQ or something like that. And I'm like, oh my goodness, this is getting, rather confusing right now. So this discussion is a timely one for myself, and I guess also for everyone joining in today. GCSE and A-level qualifications, what do we need to know as parents? A good question to start with. Over to you, Sean.
Thank you. So I think I'm going to talk to some slides in a minute that I think Jerry is going to put up on the screen. We will share a copy of those slides with you, so you don't have to worry about making notes. So really just wanted to start by saying thank you for having us today. We really appreciate the opportunity to talk to parents of students who are taking the qualifications that we regulate. It's really important for us to understand both parent and student perspective in our work. And before I get started, I wanted to confirm there will be that time for questions, and also that we recognise that, for some of you, you may be very familiar with some of the information I'm going to talk about. For others of you, as Bummer was just saying, you may be much less familiar with some of the detail of the system. So we've tried to tailor it at the right level of detail, and also to signpost other sources of information if there are things you want to look up. And as was mentioned in the introduction, if we don't get to questions, we can make sure that we answer those by way of follow-up. So I've kind of had the formal introduction about my role. As this is a session for parents, it would be helpful to share with you that I'm also a parent, but of two young children. So I've got two girls aged 6 and 8, so they're quite a long way off formal exams, but I have got two nephews who are studying for GCSEs and A-levels at the same time. So I know I think revision is in full flow in their house at the moment. So moving on to the first slide. I have just outlined here what we're going to cover today. So I'll start with an overview of the system before moving on to some of the detail about this year's arrangements, and then signpost you to some resources to help you as parents of students taking exams. In particular, kind of resources and sources of information, and a focus on coping with exam pressure as well. Thank you. So I'm going to talk first about roles and responsibilities in the system. There are lots of organisations involved in the qualification and exam system, and this diagram shows how some of that works. So you'll see on the left-hand side, it talks about centres. This is exam centres, but more simply, it's normally a school or college. So your child will most likely be sitting their exams in the school or college where they've been studying for their qualifications. There are a small number of students each year who take students in private exam centres where they've been studying independently, but I'll talk mostly about schools and colleges because we recognise that's mostly where students take their exams. So the school and college deliver the qualification and will enter students for their exams and other assessments, and of course teach and prepare them for those exams. And they'll also provide quite a lot of supporting information to your children and to you as parents. Now, we've already mentioned the different exam boards that offer qualifications. So the right-hand side of the diagram refers to the 4 awarding organisations or exam boards who provide GCSEs, AS and A-levels. So you see there you've got AQA, Educas, also known as WJC, OCR and Pearson, who are also sometimes known as EdXL. Now, depending on where your child might go to school or college, it's like, particularly if they're at school, it's likely they won't choose which exam board to take their exam with, because that's a decision that the school or college will make for them. So if you want to find out more, it is important to check which exam board they are taking their qualification with. And those exam boards have to deliver qualifications in line with Ofqual's rules and any requirements that are set out by the Department for Education as well. So to explain a little bit about Ofqual's role, we're the regulator of qualifications and assessment in England, and we regulate, as well as those 4 exam boards, about 230 awarding organisations who deliver and award qualifications in England. This means that we set rules for them to follow. and we focus on making sure that the qualification system is fair so that students, parents and others can be confident in the results they get from regulated qualifications. So we need to make sure that the qualifications and assessments meet high standards, and we monitor the exam boards and other awarding organisations, making sure that qualifications do what students, higher education institutions and employers need them to do. So qualifications must measure what students know, understand and can do. And one of the things we do is to maintain standards both over time, but also to make sure that it's no easier to get a grade with one exam board than with another. The Department for Education aren't mentioned on this slide, but I think worth mentioning. So it's the Department for Education who set the policy for qualifications. So that might be about which qualifications should be taken in schools or colleges. And they also set the subject content for GCSEs and A-levels. I've mentioned that we just cover England. So education is a devolved matter. So that means each government in Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland set their own rules and policy. So the information I give you today will be specific to England. Moving on now to the next slide, which is about qualification levels in England. So there's a wide range of regulated qualifications in England, and they range from entry level, so things like functional skills, up to level 8 qualifications, which is at a doctorate level. Although I should note that Ofqual doesn't regulate universities and higher education, we do regulate some qualifications provided by vocational and technical organisations that are at that higher level. But you'll see some of those most recognisable qualifications, so GCSE, A-level, functional skills, T-levels on there, as well as apprenticeship endpoint assessments. So we're going to mainly focus on GCSEs and A-levels today, but some of your children might also be taking AS levels or vocational and technical qualifications. So things like functional skills or applied generals, and they might be known as a BTEC or Cambridge National in school or college. And there are a whole host of different subjects offered in different qualifications. And, you know, the offer from one school or college to another is not always the same. So there's more information about, you know, the whole range of regulated qualifications available on Ofqual's website. But in terms of finding out what your school or college offers, it is important to speak to them, as I say, because that won't always be the same. So I'm going to talk now on the next slide about the GCSE grading scales. So this numerical grading scale was introduced in 2017. So for those of us who work in qualifications, that feels like quite a long time ago. But we recognise that for many parents, they will recall their own experience of qualifications. So not everyone's aware of this scale and what it means. As you can see, the scale ranges from 9 at the top end down to 1 at the bottom end of the scale. And this slide was produced when this diagram was produced when that grading scale changed to show the current grading structure against the old grading structure. So against that old A star to G model. You'll see it's not directly equivalent. So there are more grades available with 9 to 1, and there's more differentiation at the top end. So there's 9, 8 and 7, where there used to be A star and A. And because of how that maps across, there aren't directly, each grade is not directly comparable to across the two different grading scales. But what this does is to show you comparable points between the old grades and the new grades. And it's also important to remember that qualifications were awarded when it was first introduced to make sure that the same standard was carried forward despite that change to the grading scale. So I'm going to talk next about the idea of a standard pass. So each grade on the scale that I just showed you, that 9 to 1, is technically considered a pass. Apart from a U grade, which is an ungraded classification for any student that fails to achieve a grade 1. But I think it's important to recognise that government policy is that talks about a standard pass. So the Department for Education recognises grade 4 and above as a standard pass in all subjects. And what that means is that a 4 and above is similar but not the same as the old grade C or above. And there is a minimum requirement set by the government that students need to reach that grade 4 in English language and maths, or they need to continue to study those subjects as part of their post-16 education. That's only a requirement for English and maths. It doesn't apply to other subjects. And I'll come on to talk about resets a bit later on in the presentation. So moving on now to talk about the grading of level 3 qualifications. So the grading scale for A-levels ranges from A star to E, again with a U for ungraded qualifications. And then there are other qualifications, including applied generals, tech awards, T-levels, and there are different scales for those. So I haven't gone into detail about that. But I thought it was important to reference that we recognise there are students taking other qualifications which will have different grading scales. If you're unsure, then do speak to your child's school or college to find out more about what works for their qualification. So I've given you a bit of an overview there about the system, if you like, and now I want to talk a little bit about this year in particular, so the exams that are starting on Monday for the summer series 2023. So as you will all doubt know, exams were cancelled in both 2020 and 2021 because of the pandemic. Students were able to take exams last year and they had some support to recognise the disruption that was caused by the pandemic. And this year, again, exams are able to take place. And again, there is some support to recognise that disruption, but it's not quite the same as last year. So what we've done at Ofqual is to set out in this diagram, this jigsaw, that the range of support that is available. So I'll just talk you through this briefly. So you'll see in the first box, there are support materials, and this means that in GCSE maths, physics and combined science, students will be given formulae and equation sheets, so there are fewer things for them to remember in their exams. On the right-hand side, we've got the box that talks about grading protection. So students' work will be marked and graded in the normal way as it would have been before the pandemic. But the grading protection that we've introduced for GCSE and A-level students means that a student who would have achieved an A before the pandemic should be just as likely to achieve that in 2023, even if the quality of their work is a little weaker. And when talking about the grading of these qualifications, there are some important points to remember. So the rules are the same for everyone. Where the examiner doesn't know your child's name, so they're anonymous, they don't know where they studied or took their qualifications or where in the country they live. Also, examiners are expert and experienced. On average, they have about 10 years experience. There's also no set number or cap on the number of students who can achieve each grade, although that's a common misconception about the exam system. And lastly, as I said earlier, it's no easier or harder to achieve a particular grade from one exam board to the next. So the third box on the jigsaw is a spaced out timetable. So this year, exams in each subject are more spaced out than they were before the pandemic. And there are two reasons for this. One is that it will make it less likely that a student would miss all of their exams in a subject if they were unwell. But it also helps to give students a bit more time to revise and prepare between those different papers in the same subject. And lastly on there, for students who are taking GCSEs in modern foreign languages, the exams no longer have to test unfamiliar vocabulary, so that gives some extra support for students. I will also mention here vocational and technical qualifications again. It's not as easy to give a clear infographic, if you like, or jigsaw diagram for those qualifications because they are different and varied. So awarding organisations will take appropriate grading approaches depending on how those assessments are structured. And for those that are most similar to GCSEs and A-levels, they will take into account the GCSE and A-level grading approach. There are no other changes to vocational and technical qualification assessments this year, but the way that those assessments work means that students might be receiving their qualification this year with units or assessments that they've taken over the past couple of years where there have been different arrangements in place. Again, if you're unsure, I would suggest speaking to your school or college, and the awarding organisations also have information on their own websites. Okay, so I'm going to talk now about the exam timetable and contingency days as we move on to the next slide. Thank you. As I said earlier, the exams start on Monday, so they take place from the 15th of May to the 28th of June, and they follow a common timetable. Vocational and technical qualification assessments often take place throughout the year. Again, you can find more information about that from your child's school or college. Now, what is really important for students to know and understand is that there are contingency days timetabled for the afternoons of the 8th and 15th of June, as well as the whole day on the 28th of June. So these contingency days are built into the timetable, and they're designed to be used if there were a national event or significant local disruption to examinations that meant an examination at a national level had to be cancelled and rescheduled. So they're not available if, for example, an individual student can't make it to an exam for some reason. It is only if they are rescheduled nationally. So for that reason, although it's unlikely, it is really important that anyone taking their GCSEs and A-levels are available on those contingency days. Also helpful, I think, normally schools and colleges will share an individual timetable with each student, and it's really important that you and your child check this carefully. Not all exams start at the same time, and if you or your child did spot any mistakes in the timetable, or you weren't sure about the timing of any exams, it's definitely worth checking, because if your child missed an exam, and because they didn't know the date or the time, then they wouldn't get any marks for that exam. Okay, so moving on to the next slide, please. This is about the rules. So with exams imminent, it's important that students know the rules around exams. You can find out more about this from both your child's school or college or the JCQ website. JCQ are the Joint Council for Qualifications, and they are the organisation that kind of represent the exam boards, and it's them that set the rules for that schools and colleges must follow when they administer exams. So this slide focuses on a couple of areas. Firstly, what students can and can't take into the exam room. It's important they know this. So they can't take in mobiles or watches. This may sound obvious, the mobile point in particular, but each year we do see students who take mobile phones in, and this can have very serious consequences for them. It can even result in them being disqualified from their exams. So the other point is that sometimes people will offer fake exam papers for sale online before exams take place. Make sure that students know not to look at those, because there could be consequences if they did. And if you or your child spots any materials claiming to be an exam paper, you should tell the school or college straight away. Moving on now to results days. I'm sure this, if you've got children taking exams, I'm sure this is already firmly on your calendar, but the 2 days are the 17th of August for A-level and level 3 results, and the 24th of August for GCSE results. And your child's school or college will let them know how they should collect those results, whether that's in person or electronic. As well as support from your child's school or college on the day, there is a national exam results helpline and the details of that are at the end of this pack. And I think it's important to remember that there are lots of choices open to students when they receive their results. I think it's important also to mention a couple of points relating to higher education, as of course universities use the qualifications we regulate to help them make admissions decisions. So we announced the grading arrangements that are in place back in September, so that universities understood the approach to grading and took it into account when making offers, and that doesn't have any impact on the number of university places available. Okay, so moving on then to the next slide. This is about reviews of marking and moderation. So firstly, a little bit about marking and moderation. Awarding organisations mark exam papers and any non-exam assessment. Marking's done in different ways. It might be paper-based or online, and it is likely to be, in fact, that one paper would be marked by several different people. As I've said, markers don't see students' names or school or college they attend, and awarding organisations check markers' work at every stage to make sure it's consistent and high quality. If your child has taken a qualification that includes non-exam assessment, so things like practical work or a performance, this might be marked by the awarding organisation or by your child's teacher. If you have any concerns about how that assessment was marked, you should speak to your school or college. For GCSEs, AS and A-level assessments that are marked by your child's teacher, they are entitled to know their marks, and if they don't think their mark is correct, they can ask their school or college to review it. So your first port of call there is to speak to your school or college. Student work is then moderated by the exam board, and moderation is when teachers' marking is checked using a sample to make sure that it meets the awarding organisation's expectations, so a kind of standardisation process. And that's to make sure that marking across all different schools and colleges is consistent with the national standard. And your child's work could be included in that sample. Now, quality assurance that I've talked about of marking and moderation means that there shouldn't be errors, but in a system of such huge scale, it is possible that errors can occur, and it's important there's a process in place to check that. So if you or your child think that there has been a mistake in the marking of your exam, of their exam or assessment, they should talk to their school or college. And the school or college can ask the awarding organisation to check if there were any errors in how the exam or assessment was marked. Now, if you ask them to do that and they chose not to do that, you could ask them to review that decision. And for some qualifications, that includes GCSEs, AS and A-levels, your child's school or college can ask to see their marked exam script before they decide whether to request a review of marking. That was a change introduced a few years ago, and I think schools and colleges have found that helpful. So I won't go into too much more detail here, but just I think it's important to remember that an awarding organisation cannot give a student extra marks just because their mark was close to a grade boundary or because they didn't get their predicted grades. So in most years at A-level, only about half of students achieve the grades that they got predicted at school. So if a student doesn't get their predicted grade, it doesn't necessarily mean that something's gone wrong with the marking or grading of that exam. And there's lots more information about this process on the Ofqual website and in our student guide. So moving on to the next slide, I said that I would mention RECIT. So it's government policy that education is compulsory until age 18, and a young person needs to stay in full-time education or start an apprenticeship or traineeship. I mentioned that point about a standard pass. So if a student doesn't get a 4, if they get a 3 or below, they will need to resit their GCSE maths and English language, and they can do that in the November after they've taken their summer exams. For all other GCSEs, AS and A-levels, they would need to resit if they chose to do so. There's no requirement for them to. They would need to do that the following summer. So if your child does need to resit, then speak to their school or college first. And there's also a National Career Service helpline that they run over the exam results period, which is detailed on the last slide, and that can be a really helpful source of information. So I've given you a lot of information there about the system. Hopefully that's been a useful overview. I just, before I come on to talk about the resources available, I just want to mention coping with exam pressure. We could move on to the next slide, please. Thank you. And this is a guide that Ofqual has produced with some experts in this area. So I'm not an expert in this, and at Ofqual we regulate qualifications, but we think it's important to provide support so that where we can. And we've worked with experts to come up with this guide. And some of it may sound like common sense, but actually it's all evidence-based. We've worked on it with academics from the University of Manchester. So the first point is about replacing negative beliefs with positive beliefs. And that talks about finding a positive, realistic belief that can replace a more negative one. So something like, if your negative belief was, I'm rubbish at maths, a positive, realistic alternative could be, even if I will never be the best at maths, I will do better if I have a revision plan and I stick to it. And researchers found that those small changes can really help to shift children's mindset to be more positive. It also talks about how to plan revision, so having a plan, setting targets and checking progress, making it manageable, but also testing that plan. So you can have the best plan in the world, but if it's not working for you, you need to review it. It's also, the guide also talks about stress not necessarily being a bad thing. So people react in different ways. For some, stress can be a great motivator, but for some it can be a bad thing. And it's about spotting the signs where that becomes difficult and learning how to cope more effectively. The guide also talks about some of the different signs of high exam anxiety, things like going blank in the exam, feeling panic, fast heartbeat, churning stomach, all those symptoms that many of us will recognise from our own experiences of exams. And it's important to remember that actually, you know, most people will have some of those symptoms. And the important thing is about managing those and identifying and seeking support where it becomes unmanageable for people. And there are a couple of suggestions about how to control those physical reactions to anxiety, things like deep breathing and yoga and mindfulness in there. So if we move on to nearly the last slide. This is a roundup of all those resources, some of which I have referred to already. So Ofqual has a website which we update regularly. So you go to the update page, we have a guide for students and a guide for schools and colleges. We have a letter to parents on there, and we're adding to that all the time. So do keep an eye out. The second column talks about the resources for coping with exam pressure, and as well as that guide, there are a number of blogs and organisations where you can get more support. I've also spoken about the National Career Service and their exam results support. Would really recommend that as a source of information and support around the results period. And lastly, both JCQ and the exam boards have lots of information available as well. So I've given you lots of information there. I will just end on our last slide by really just wishing you and of course your children all the best for their exams and all the preparation that I know they will be doing between now and then. So thank you very much.
Right, thank you very much. That is quite an informative session. I think we will go straight to questions now, and I'll hand over to Peace. If you could help, start the questions from the audience. Thank you.
Right, thank you very much. Thank you, Sian. That was wonderful. Yes, we do have some questions. And very quickly, let me just say this to everyone. Thank you all for your attention and your engagement so far. We have now reached the question and answer portion of today's webinar. So please, I am so very excited to hear your thoughts and your questions. So to ask a question, you can just submit your question via the Q&A box. There's a chat box you can see right in front of you. Use that chat box function. We'll do our best to answer. And of course, if we can answer because of our allotted time, we'll just go on ahead and pass the answers later. Right, so we do have a question here. Thank you, Yemi, by the way. I see you type in there just to keep up with the chats. Yes, okay. So we do have a particular one here. Where are you? So you're just about now. Oof.
Is it the one about formula sheets in future years? Is it that one?
Yes, please. One particular important one that I saw, and I just answered that person that we're going to take it live. Well, I kind of missed it now.
I can take that.
Okay,
I can take that one.
yes, the one here says, do schools share predicted grades with the exam board? Can you take that, please?
No, they don't share predicted grades with the exam board. So they would submit so school would share, or college would share a predicted grade with UCAS for the purposes of their applications to higher education, but they wouldn't share that with the exam board.
All right, thank you very much. All right, so we do have another one. It says, how can parents help children who are very stressed, even if they are succeeding?
That's a tricky one, and something that I guess as a parent, even though my daughter's very young, she is quite an anxious child. She's already worried about her stats, and she's not doing them for 2 years. But I think that's something I guess I can't particularly comment on. I think there is a lot of support and guidance out there. I think the guides that the guide that we have worked on, as I say, is evidence-based, and there are also tips in the blog series that we've worked on with some psychologists. So I'd recommend looking there. I guess just often, knowing about how the system works can be reassuring. So making sure you have got the information that you need.
Thank you, Sian. To just add to that, I believe it's the best time to be their friend. Just be their friend at this time. If you were in their shoes, what would you want your parent to do? So yes, thank you for answering that question, Sian. It's been absolutely wonderful. And I have even learned so much here. I believe that, how to cope with stress. This isn't just for your children, parents. You can also apply this to yourself, be positive always, smash those limiting beliefs that can stop you from doing great things. And of course, we will be talking more on our platform, parents. So yeah, Sian, thank you. God bless you. Bumi, over to you. Thank you so much.
I think we missed one more question. How likely is it that support sheets for maths, physics, and combined science will be available in future years?
So that's not likely. The arrangements that were in place for the formula sheets for this year were just put in place for this year. So it would be a decision taken with the Department for Education, but that's not likely. No, it's expected that things will return to normal next year. Right.
I don't know if you've answered this. Do schools share predicted grades? I think you've answered that, isn't it?
Yeah.
Okay. Jerry's, someone just mentioned, Abiola only mentioned that the last slide was not displayed. Please, can you show that again? So the last slide, I think, the last slide from the presentation, if you can just show that again. So, does it matter, Sean? I've got a couple of other questions from Michael. Does it matter which board exam the child is sitting for and which board is the best?
So no, it doesn't matter which which exam board the child is sitting with. So one of Ofqual's roles, if you like, is to make sure that for GCSEs, AS and A-levels, We set a number of rules, and we check that each of those boards meet those rules, and standards are set in such a way that even though the exam papers will be different in a subject with different exam boards, the standard is the same. So it should be no easier or more difficult to get a grade with one than another. So essentially, it's a qualifications market, and school or college will have different reasons for choosing different exam boards. It might be, in English because they like the texts with one than another. There are a whole range of reasons why a school would choose a particular exam board. But yeah, our job is to make sure that that system is fair and that students aren't disadvantaged or advantaged by taking qualifications of a particular organisation.
Right. Thanks for that clarification, because I was a bit, I think I had that in mind as well to ask. I've got a question from Toyin. How does grade protection work in practice?
Okay, so how this works is that the grading nationally this year will return to the national standard that was in place before the pandemic. So during the pandemic, because there were different assessment arrangements, so because teachers gave grades and there weren't exams, the national profile of results was higher. We think and have made the decision that it's important to return to those trusted standards. And so this year, nationally, results will be lower than they were in 2022, but they will be similar to nationally to how they were in 2019. What that means in terms of how grading protection will work is that how grading works basically is that examiners will mark all the questions on the papers as normal, and then they set grade boundaries, and that's done across the exam boards, as I say, to make sure that that is fair. The way in which they do that is based on a combination of statistics, so on a range of evidence about how this year's exam cohort nationally is expected to perform based on their prior attainment. But as well as using those statistics, the examiners will look at samples of student work at the grade boundaries to make sure that as they decide where those grade boundaries sit, they can use their professional judgment. And it will be at that point. So if the quality of work is a little lower than they might have otherwise expected, those as they set the grade boundaries, they will take that into account. So what that means is nationally, the outcomes nationally will be similar this year to what they were in 2019. So essentially what that means, I realise that's quite a complicated explanation. So what that means that if your child in 2019 or in any year pre-pandemic, for example, would have been most likely to get a B in their A-level geography, then they will be just as likely to get that B this year. Now, of course, this is about kind of setting standards at a national level. Actually, there are many, many factors that will affect what an individual student will get, which are not within the control of the assessment itself, if you like. So I hope that answers your question.
Right, thanks for that. We've got a couple of more questions, and I think we're running out of time. Are you okay to take one or two more questions?
Sure.
Okay. So I've got, at the exam board, this question is from Stanley, at the exam board writing the same GCSE questions?
So the GCSE papers for each exam board will be different. So they have to follow the same subject content, which is set by the government, and they also have to set our rules. So the questions themselves will be different, but they will be examining the same content and be the same length of exam and the same level of demand. Right.
Thanks for that. Last question. From Murewa, what are the main differences between English system and the Scottish system?
Okay. So there are quite significant differences. The Scottish system doesn't take GCSEs, takes highers, and there are differences in terms of there are quite a number of differences, actually, probably too many to summarise here. And those differences are long-standing, as we say, because of the fact that education is a devolved matter. But you could find more information about that on the Scottish Qualifications regulator website.
Right. Thank you very much for that. I think we've run out of time. There are a couple of other questions in the Q&A section. What we will do is we will collate all these questions and we'll possibly send them across to Sean. So our webinar will extend beyond today. We will send this over. If you could please just help with, detailing answers to those questions so we can share with parents after the webinar, if that's okay.
Yeah, sure.
Great, lovely. So thank you so very much. Thank you very much. We are almost out of time. I've definitely found today's discussion insightful and informative, and I hope we all have to. Thank you so much, Sean and Hazel. Can we still have a final word of advice from you both before we round up today's session? Sean, any final word of advice for parents?
I guess just, as a parent, I think it's about just being there for your child. And, I think personally, I think it can be as anxious and nerve-wracking as a parent as it is when, you're going through it as a child. So I suppose just empathizing and supporting them and making sure they've got the support that they need.
Hazel, any word of advice for parents?
Similarly to Sean, I would just say that if you need to find out further information, speak to the school and college, and they'll be able to help you and signpost you to the right information.
Absolutely. Thank you so very much for that wonderful advice. Well, that is it from us today. And but before we go, I would like to let you know our next line of events for parents. Our next webinar will be by the end of May. And the topic is on cultural inclusiveness in the UK. We will be sharing a lot of content around cultural inclusiveness in the UK. We also have a parent webinar for Africa coming up, titled Investing in Our Future is Investing in Our Children. So join us as we engage experts from across the globe to discuss the latest resource and address some of the lingering issues that affect children and young people. Also, feel free to check out our parent web app for further details and to register to be part of the discussion. I would like to say a big thank you to our esteemed speakers from Ofqual for today's session, for a brilliant, informative and engaging session. Thank you very much for joining us at Africanus today. Thank you to our wonderful audience for attending the webinar today. If your questions were not answered today, like I did say, please be rest assured that answers will be provided by our parent web app. We'll be sharing resources and materials from Ofqual that will be beneficial for parents as well. So connect with us via our parent web app or check through our website to access some of these materials. From me today, what I've learned today as parents is time to start supporting our young people, both before, during, and after their GCSE and A-level examinations, and make it stress-free for everyone. Active parenting is kind of very essential in today's era, and it starts with getting the right information to support our young people. We hope you found the information today useful that will help you as parents to support your child. And to every parent and student writing the GCSE and A-level examinations in few days, we wish you great success. Let's not forget to connect with one another, to live our best, and to thrive as parents. Have a very great afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us today. Welcome to Africanus Parent Talk Series, where we connect, live, and thrive. I am Bumi Olabi, CEO Africanus, and today's webinar is filled with expert insight, strategies, and tips from our experienced speakers to help you become the best possible partner in your child's life journey. Whether you're dealing with common parenting challenges like discipline, communication, their well-being, education, or you're trying to build a strong parent-child bond, this webinar has got you covered. Before we get started, I would like to introduce a parent community where we connect you to the courses that matters most to you, ensuring that the support and network you need the most are available to create a kind and thriving family. A community to connect, to network, to share experiences, get advice, and make new friends. We have several parent groups where you can connect with groups of friends, or connect with parents with similar interests, or possibly connect with parents across the continents. Join our community today through our parent web app. You get to know the latest events or webinars sent directly to your phone. You receive updates on our blogs and resources, and you also get to connect with expert speakers and professionals. And most importantly, you get all your parenting information and tips in one place. Connect, live, and thrive. Join us today.